Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Clausen. I'm the Director of Research here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I direct our Iran program. I have the pleasure of greeting the few who braved the coronavirus to come out today. We are noticing a distinct impact on Institute events of the current health situation. But we have a very timely topic. And that is, as the dust has settled from the death of Qasem Soleimani, we thought it was a good opportunity to take a look at what's happening to the IRGC and what are the challenges that it faces going forward. We certainly heard a lot in the days and the hours after Soleimani's death about what would this mean for the Middle East and what would well, we want to look in particular what this means for the IRGC. So we have assembled a panel that will cover a variety of topics about the challenges for the IRGC. I think that our first speaker will be Ariane Tabatabai, and she is at the RAND Corporation, as well as an adjunct at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And I believe she's going to concentrate on Soleimani's successor and how's he doing, and what are we likely to see from him and what challenges he faces. Then our next speaker is Farzin Nadimi, who's an associate fellow at the Institute, and who follows in great detail some of the military challenges facing the IRGC, especially in its campaign for influence throughout the region. And then finally, we'll have Mehdi Khalaji, who's the Libitzky Family Fellow here at the Washington Institute and has long followed Iran's domestic political scene to discuss how the challenges the IRGC is going to face in the Iranian domestic political scene. So, and please follow my example and put your phones on stun, or even better, turn them off. Thank you. Can I persuade you to? Please, yes.
All right, thank you so much, Patrick and Bilal, and to the Institute for having me here today, and those of you who braved not just the coronavirus, but also the crisp weather that we have today, the wind, which is amazing. So yeah, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the changes that we're seeing in the IRGC, Soleimani's legacy, and talk a little bit about his successor, what we know about him so far. He's someone who was fairly unknown to, I would say, the majority of Iranians, let alone Americans, until fairly recently. And he's now going to be replacing one of the most influential people to have been involved in Iranian political and military decision-making in recent years and decades. So I thought we would talk a little bit about that, and that should hopefully set us up for the rest of the conversation about what we may expect next as Iran adjusts to the death of Soleimani and as his successor continues the activities that Soleimani had undertaken. So the first thing I want to note is that the IRGC, generally speaking, as an organization, has proved to be a fairly resilient and fairly flexible organization. It has managed to go through decades of transformation, and actually one of the chief contributions that Soleimani made to the IRGC, I think, is and part of his legacy is to have allowed for the IRGC Quds Force specifically to blossom, to become this integral part of the Iranian security infrastructure that we know today. So he is not actually the first commander of the IRGC. There was someone before him, but he's the most well-known. There's only been two commanders, now three, since Soleimani. But he is obviously better known than his predecessor for obvious reasons. It's under Soleimani that the IRGC Quds Force became such a sort of a visible part of the Iranian security architecture. It's under his leadership that Iran began to expand its influence, project power beyond its own borders. So we tend to associate a lot of Iranian activities recently undertaken by Iran in the region with Soleimani, but it is worth noting that he is not the first commander, though he did make, and again, achieve part of his legacy with regard to the IRGC Quds Force, is that he was able to make this organization that was fairly nascent when he took over into this sort of powerhouse of Iranian political and security policies. So going forward, now Ghani, who is his successor, is taking over what is a fairly mature organization, one that has been able to adapt, that has been able to overcome a number of challenges, and that has become a lot more bureaucratic. And I think that is something to consider here, because we tend to talk about the IRGC Quds Force as essentially a one-man show, right? We don't really talk about most of the operatives in the force for obvious reasons, but I think there was sort of an expectation that the killing of Soleimani would be a huge blow to the IRGC Quds Force. But I think it's important to contextualize that and to take into account the fact that this is very much a bureaucracy and that is not simply a one-man show. And Soleimani very much wanted to, it seems like he understood the value of having something that was much more structured, much more of a bureaucratic organization than a one-man show. Of course, that had its shortcomings, and Soleimani's own charisma, his own sort of personal relationships played a huge role in shaping some of those shortcomings, and I'll come back to them in a second. In terms of the individual differences, I think, between Soleimani and Ghani today, we can point to a couple of things. And I think Ghani both has some weaknesses compared to Soleimani, but he also he seems to have some strengths as well that seem to be in line with what Soleimani was able to achieve. So let's just talk about the strengths for a bit, and I suspect my colleagues will talk about this a bit more when they talk about the internal structure within the IRGC and the role of the IRGC in the Iranian political ecosystem more generally. But Soleimani tried to stay under the radar for the most part, right? It is only in recent years that Soleimani became a household name. And that was mostly due to the fight against ISIS and Iran's growing role in Syria and later on in Yemen as well. Prior to that, most people didn't really know who Soleimani was, what he really did. He was not really that significant, or visible, I should say, not significant, but he was not a very visible figure. So he gradually became more and more visible after the Syrian civil war at first, and then the rise of ISIS. But in terms of domestic politics, he really tried to stay at least visibly, at least in the public sphere, outside of it. On a number of occasions, very few occasions, he seems to have interfered. He seems to have tried to change the course of events. But generally speaking, he was trying to play the apolitical sort of role, a lot more so than most figures in the Islamic Republic. That seems to be one thing that Ghani is inclined to also follow. He's given very few media interviews, for example. We can point to very few actually taped interviews of him or press interviews of him. He's tried to kind of stay under the radar and not be too forthcoming with his political views. And so he seems to be inclined to follow in Soleimani's footsteps in that area. That said, one question mark to me is that, as the events of 2019 and 2020 so far have demonstrated, the regime is under a lot of stress. And it increasingly looks like a regime that is under a lot of stress. You don't go and kill hundreds of people in protests or shut down the internet or disqualified half your candidates for elections if you're not feeling like your legitimacy is being challenged. So as the IRGC sees itself at the realm of a system, a political system that is under a lot of stress, that is whose legitimacy is suffering, that might change. But so far, anyway, again, it seems like Ghani's inclination is to continue in Soleimani's footsteps in terms of being fairly low-key and under the radar in Iranian politics. But two things that I think are key weaknesses that Ghani has, and where there is a departure actually from Soleimani, is that he doesn't have the same charisma that Soleimani did. Soleimani was well known for being a fairly charismatic leader. He was actually able to make connections within the Quds force itself. He had this sort of reputation with his own men, but also within the broader Iranian political system. He was someone who was respected by essentially all sides of the Iranian political system, regardless of whether they're reformists or principalists or and everything in between. And the reason, again, for it was that he tried to stay away from politics visibly, but also because he had this sort of charisma. And that was really helpful for him. Ghani doesn't have that, not that we've seen anyway. He doesn't seem to have the same sort of traction that Soleimani had. And relatedly, Soleimani was able to cultivate these interpersonal relationships with various proxy leaders. And Ghani doesn't seem to have the same level of depth, of in-depth personal relationships with proxy leaders that Soleimani had. So, these two things are pretty significant, given that he's operating in a region and in a political system where informal personal relationships are very important, as they are in a lot of places, but even more so there. And so those two things are going to be challenges for him to overcome, and it's not clear to me yet how he may be able to do so. I want to stop, before I stop, I'm going to talk about one more thing, which is which areas we may see Ghani cultivating more, and which areas we may expect more continuity in. So, it's been quite clear for the past decade or so that Iran has been increasingly building its influence in Syria, in Iraq, and increasingly so in Yemen. But one area where, in general, the IRGC Quds Force had not really leveraged its influence to play spoiler with regard to the United States was actually in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a particularly interesting area because Ghani has a really deep relationship with Afghanistan, with various groups in that country. Just during the Iran-Iraq war itself, where Ghani was an IRGC officer, he was overseeing 2 units that were populated by Afghan fighters who were put on the battlefield to fight the Iraqis. After the war, Ghani was involved with Iranian operations in Afghanistan to undercut the Taliban. And then later after that, this is much more recently, Ghani was involved in, and had been involved until recently, with the Fatimiyun unit that is a unit that is composed of Afghan fighters that is deployed to Syria. So he has this deep relationship with a number of Afghan proxies and fighters. He's been cultivating that relationship for a while, and he'd been known for his knowledge and experience in Afghanistan. Now, as things evolve in Afghanistan, as the peace talks move forward or don't, and as the competition between the United States and Iran continues to unfold, as tensions continue to unfold, Afghanistan may actually become another area of competition for the two countries. And so we might see more of what we've seen so far in Iraq moving and shifting to Afghanistan as well. So that is one area to watch for in terms of fluidity, in terms of what may change. But I think that actually in Lebanon and Iraq, in Syria, we might see more of the same by Ghani. Again, he may not be as equipped to have those personal relationships that Soleimani had, but certainly he seems to have the same sort of approach to those different theaters, and Iranian interests in those theaters continue to be fairly steady for now, anyway. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Proceed.
let me focus on a certain period of time right after the assassination or killing of General Qasem Soleimani. On January 8th, a blooded Iran launched a barrage of missiles at a U.S. base in western Iraq in retaliation for the U.S. targeting of Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani 5 days earlier in Baghdad. Notwithstanding which targets within this compound was chosen and why, and which ones were precisely hit, and many indeed were. It's more about how this turning point in Iranian behavior might and will affect the future strategic thinking of the IRGC strategists. A turning point because this attack was the first time in the 40-year history of the Islamic regime that the manned U.S. military objective was overtly targeted by Iran. Past episodes were either covert or in heat of a firefight or indeed more recently involved an unmanned platform. This time, the risk of killing U.S. service members were high, and they knew it. The shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner over Tehran a few hours after this attack, after they apparently mistook it for an American cruise missile, is the evidence that how much they had taken that step seriously. In 2015, commander of the IRGC, General Qasem Soleimani, made it clear that IRGC always planned and prepared for the worst-case scenario. They actually believe they can win this, and this war against the great Satan, the real enemy, and inevitably this will affect their decision-making process. Such episodes will convince them that they have this capability to win against this enemy. In fact, in 2017, Soleimani said they usually follow a strategic criteria and a strategic logic when they decide upon the range of their weapons and the capabilities of their weapons. So by advocating the global strike options, the U.S. Can impose upon Tehran the prohibitively costly path of developing a working capability such as ICBM, that there has been talks of whether Iran is actually developing one or not. So hoping they will buckle under the technological challenges and costs of this monumental task. These episodes of targeting the U.S. bases in the region can, and I believe should again wake up decision makers to this debate of whether to go ahead with this basing debate or for a more global prompt global strike capability. They actually investing more on their missile capabilities as a result of such experiences. And they are shrinking the size of their new missiles, and they are making them more of components that they are more difficult to detect by anti-missile defenses. That is one of the reasons the Treasury has been increasingly targeting individuals and companies that involved in shipping Iran's the required raw material for producing more advanced missiles. 4 days after the missile strikes, General Soleimani attended Iran's parliament and delivered a sort of after-action report, partly about the killing of Qasem Soleimani and the resulting missile attack, and partly about the downing of the airliner. In his speech, he, for the first time in Iran, referred to the effects-based operations as their concept of choice to force the U.S. out of the region. So why did the IRGC suddenly find this concept attractive? Even though Soleimani have been talking about the need for widening the impact area of their actions within the region or beyond, actually, against the enemy's coalition arrangements, to change it into a center of division. Their new strategy is to threaten us offensively and lethally anywhere and any time. And they recently to stress that. Of course, within range capabilities and to manage the enemy's perception management. Another DoD term that they have been using recently. So how this concept can influence IRGC's way of warfare, including asymmetric warfare, and if or how they can predict their future, we can predict their future behavior by looking at, for example, this concept of EBO, or effects-based operations. The effects-based operation is an established military term, American military term, which in short means to achieve a military and or political objective or effect with minimal force. Salami has been one of the main strategies of the IRGC and perhaps the Islamic regime as a whole. And his appointment to the job was generally seen as a seal of approval by the Iranian Supreme Leader to his thoughts, which are quite often shrouded in a rhetorical tone. And by using bold new terminologies, he tries often to define his strategic views. Salami and his colleagues see themselves at the forefront of the very complex war with their main enemy, the United States and Israel. And in doing so, they try to use whatever cutting-edge methods and concepts they can get their hands on. Now, IRGC is out and about, fulfilling the Islamic regime's grand strategy in the Middle East, using proxy groups, increasingly equipped with more advanced weapons. We see that in Iraq, and we see that in Yemen, for example, and also Hezbollah in Lebanon, using kits receiving from Iran to upgrade their rockets into precision missiles. What military strategic and operational concept it has adopted, and why to that end, and how it sees the prospects in medium to long term is something we have to watch closely. The U.S. should expect this concept influence IRGC's way of warfare for some time to come in the future. 5 years ago, Iran's Supreme Leader spoke of the end of the era of hit and run and the dawn of a more equal era in which the enemies, namely the U.S. and Israel, should expect sharp and painful response if they cross Iran's red lines. I believe that recent experiences suggest that we have to take this seriously. And a possible move of main command and control the structure in Iran to go beyond asymmetric warfare capabilities into more equal terms. They believe that they are now in a more equal footings against their main enemies. And what was the main incentive behind the strategic decision to move? It is historically. There are historical precedent to that, and one example is when the U.S. U-2 flight was shot down in 1960 over Russia, and that caused a shift from the use of manned overflights over Russia into use of spy satellites. And I believe the experiences like IRGC attacking against a U.S. base in Iraq should also serve as an opportunity to see the vulnerability of forward basing to new Iranian capabilities and either consider greatly upgrading the existing missile defenses in the area, especially for U.S. bases, or consider other options like moving back and using certain new technologies like hypersonic missiles to continue to assure the regional allies of the U.S. capabilities to help protect them. The United States cannot afford to be seen to capitulate to the Islamic regime's wishes, even if it decides to reduce its engagement within the Middle East. The United States must show beyond doubt that it still has the capability and will to protect its interests and those of its vital allies in the region in the future. On the other hand, they seem to be relating their new, the Iranians seem to be relating their new precision capabilities to our new technological advantages and show they can fight in an equal level with the US, as I mentioned before. So the United States will have to deal with a less than great power level adversary, which is quite capable militarily. So we advocate engagement in the Middle East on a daily basis. We advocate supporting our allies in the region on a daily basis. However, we also have to have the option of protecting our forces in the region using capable layered missile defenses, and which we simply cannot afford to ignore. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm trying to say a few words about the impact of the demise of General Soleimani on the Iranian leadership. As you know, General Soleimani was a unique person for Khamenei as the Supreme Leader and Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces, because of the unique characteristics this man had. First of all, unlike many other commanders in IRGC, he has shown no interest in interfering in Iranian domestic politics. So you would hardly find any indication that he has influenced any election or any important development in Iran while he was the commander of Quds Force. On the other hand, he was one of the cleanest commander of IRGC in terms of economy and financial activities. So he was living a very modest life, and he proved to Khamenei that nothing is more important for him than following his orders. So he was a truthful soldier for Khamenei, who was irrepressible. So what does the assassination of Mr. Soleimani mean for Khamenei? It means a lot. But probably the demise of Soleimani was not only one loss for Khamenei, but it was two losses, a double loss. Because Khamenei naturally wanted to use this incident to mobilize people behind the government and highlight the importance of or priority of the security over other issues. But the coincidence of the demise of Soleimani with the IRGC's mistake in downing a passenger airplane or Ukrainian airplane, and the way government dealt with this situation by hiding this news from people for 3 days and then issuing contradictory reports about what happened, and even now they failed to cooperate with the foreign government, including Ukraine, to provide the black box to the Ukrainian government and releasing the many information needed for finding out what was the truth. So that made the whole thing go in a totally different way. So that distracted the people's attention from the assassination of Soleimani and what could be a very important a source for government to use to provoke anti-American sentiment among Iranians. But I think a process which was started mostly after Khamenei came to power, which was the securitization of the government, making or building a state of security in Iran. The demise of Soleimani helped Khamenei to accelerate this process. So I think probably if it was not this incident, it could be harder for the government to choose such an aggressive policy in disqualifying the majority of reformists and moderate candidates in the election for the parliament. So the way government dealt with the election was based on this confidence that nobody would react that much to this, kind of aggressive policy that Guardian Council has chosen. So you wouldn't see that, any demonstration in Iran. Or, for example, we had, in 6 Majlis, we had large reaction from even the members of Majlis against Guardian Council disqualification of many candidates. You wouldn't see anything like this time. So everything went on smoothly without that much problem for the government. And I think that was one of the result or one of the implication, but the good side of what happened with regard to the Soleimani. But I think probably one of the most important implication of Soleimani's assassination would appear when Khamenei dies, which I hope wouldn't die before I finish his biography. It would be a big disaster for me. One of American journalists advised me finish the biography of Khamenei before he dies, or you die. So I hope I can do it before I die. So if Mr. Khamenei dies, as you know, we do not have any established pattern for the transition of power in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power just naturally as a result of revolution, and nobody appointed him as the supreme leader. He became the supreme leader of Islamic Republic out of a revolution. The attempt for appointing a successor for Khomeini when he was alive, which was the appointment of Mr. Montazeri as his successor, it didn't go well. And Montazeri became a problem maker for Khomeini, and he was dismissed in his last, I think, 2 months before he dies. So when the procedure of appointing a successor for Khomeini was not quite designed or did not was not following the constitution. Khamenei became the supreme leader while he was not an Ayatollah. So according to the constitution, he had to be an Ayatollah, and he wasn't. So the whole decision was made by a handful of people who were running the country actually when Khomeini was alive, because especially when Khomeini was alive in his last 3 years, he was so sick, he was not able to actually lead the country. The country was led by his son, Rafsanjani, Khamenei, and Mousavi Ardebili, and just 4-5 people. The same people decided who's going to be this next supreme leader just 2 weeks before Khomeini dies, when they concluded that he's going to go away soon. And they used the assembly of experts to legalize this decision. The problem this time is that we don't have those four or five influential individuals. This time, instead of individuals, we have organizations, we have institutions, we have IRGC, we have judiciary, we have intelligence apparatus, we have very important and large institutions with different factions inside them. For example, when it comes to Revolutionary Guard, we know that Revolutionary Guard is factional. We know that there are different circle of powers in this circles of power in this organization. They have different kind of attitude toward many things, different level of commitment or loyalty toward the Islamic ideology, different views about the foreign policy, different economic interest. So it's going to be quite difficult for these people to make decision about their leadership. First of all, everyone wants to have a share of power. Whether inside Revolutionary Guard or clergy or, bazaar or judiciary, those who have gun in their hand or the key of prison. So the problem is that in such situation, you would need someone to act like a mediator, In 1989, the mediator was Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani was a non-partisan, influential leader who could help to make some sort of consensus among different parts or different factions of Islamic Republic and help this process go smoothly. And it did happen. But, this time we don't have Rafsanjani. We don't even have the son of Khomeini. We don't have Montazeri. We don't have, any big figure who could be, whose authority could be recognized by different sides of Islamic Republic's elite. Qasem Soleimani actually could play such an important role because this guy, by refraining from intervening in any sort of activities within the domestic politics or taking side on this faction or that faction, he was a non-partisan figure among the elite of Islamic Republic. So he was respected not only by conservative but also by reformists. He was, everyone who could take a picture with him, even Zarif or Jalili, he could get a credit. So everyone was trying to somehow get close to him. And in time of crisis after Khamenei's death, I think he could be the most important or the most likely person to play the role of mediator and help these different factions and different tendencies within the Islamic Republic's elite to sit together and make some sort of concession and appoint a successor for Khamenei. In the absence of Soleimani, it is very difficult to imagine how these people can actually talk to each other. We know that now we don't see any sign of conflict within Revolutionary Guard or between Revolutionary Guard and the Astan Quds Razavi, the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, or between Revolutionary Guard and foundations, or between judiciary and other organizations. We don't see that because this is Khamenei who is above them. Khamenei is not omnipotent. Khamenei is not too powerful, but he's the most powerful among them. nobody has his power. So he's able to manage the fight between these groups, between these institutions. In the absence of Khamenei, we don't know who's going to replace him. So I stop here. Thank you.
Actually, let's switch over to using these mics here on the table. So let me ask a question of each of the three of you. Let me first start with Ariane. Could you talk about what role you think that Nasrallah is going to play in this new environment? Is he going to step up to take on some kind of the charismatic functions that Soleimani used to play? And what do you see as his ties with Ghani, and especially since it's said that Ghani doesn't speak Arabic, how much of an impediment is that? And then Farzin, listening to you, I was struck how your picture of what the IRGC's strategy is going forward was heavily reliant on missiles and technology and drones, and there wasn't that much talk about the proxies. Does this mean that the Quds Force is really has been the instrument of the last decade, and that going forward, that what we'll see is that the IRGC will be shifting to a more, really a more technologically advanced approach for challenging the United States rather than a proxy-based approach for challenging the United States? And then Mehdi, I know it's a little bit off our topic today, but let's face it, everybody in Iran is talking about the coronavirus. And it is striking that here we see a major political crisis unfolding in Iran, in which the IRGC seems to be completely absent. And the institutions that are involved are much more the clergy and the regular government. I mean, the health ministry is the ministry in which the regular government, the president, has the most power over the health ministry, I think, of any ministry in his entire government. Rouhani presented himself as being a competent technocrat, unlike Ahmadinejad, and yet here we see the competent technocrats messing up even worse than the IRGC did. So,
should I start?
Please.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one figure that I actually didn't mention in my opening remarks is Hijazi, who's now the deputy to Ghani, who is an interesting figure complementing some of the things I was talking about earlier on with regard to Ghani. Also fairly similar in that he's been fairly low key, but he also brings a lot of experience, a lot of skills to the table, and so he is going to be complementing Ghani in areas where I think that Ghani may have some shortcomings. So Nasrallah will of course be a part of the picture. We know that the IRGC has increasingly relied on Hezbollah, on Lebanese Hezbollah, over the past few decades, and has tried to use it really as sort of a secondary, sort of a deputy to itself, right, with regard to giving it more power, more tools to train, advise, assist, equip, and support various proxies so that the IRGC doesn't have to necessarily put boots on the ground in Yemen. It can actually use Hezbollah operatives to do the work that it would be otherwise doing. That allows the IRGC to kind of get more plausible deniability that it would be getting otherwise, and two, to not stretch itself too thin as it continues to expand its influence in the region. So Nasrallah specifically and Hezbollah more generally do play an increasingly big role, but at the end of the day, Ghani first and foremost and Hijazi second, I think are still the key figures that the IRGC Quds Force is going to be relying on rather than Nasrallah. And one reason is that the obvious, right? They're Iranian. They're part of the IRGC Quds Force. They are much more trusted, and Nasrallah, I think, has a very special status among proxy leaders, in that he is fairly seen as very loyal. He's always been one of the only proxy leaders to pose for photos with the Supreme Leader, with the highest levels of the Iranian system. Before that was the case with the Houthis, for example, which is a much more recent development. But at the end of the day, it's still not an Iranian individual. And so that is one reason why that would be the case. The second thing is that Nasrallah can't navigate Iranian domestic politics and the domestic system to the same extent that, say, a Ghani or a Hijazi is able to do. And a key role for the IRGC commander that Soleimani certainly had embraced, as Mehdi was saying earlier on, is that he was able to work across factions. He was able to, of course, he was trusted by the Supreme Leader himself, but also with someone like Zarif, who had a very good working relationship with Soleimani. And that's something that someone like Nasrallah, even someone like Nasrallah, is not really able to do.
Thank you.
I think the most recent experiences showed Iran that their investment in advanced technologies, in missile precision missiles, and probably in the future longer-range missiles, had been a wise decision, and it can offer a better deterrence. What's the pillar of Iran's military doctrine is offering a deterrence against their enemies, and since the new national security strategy of the United States was unveiled in 2018, and its insistence on unpredictability, operational unpredictability, Iran has seen this as a reason to more focus on its own unpredictability and offensive posture, and by to do that more effectively and more quickly, they need to invest more on the technological aspects. I believe Quds Force has also shifted more toward using and applying advanced technologies into their proxy operations, and one reason is to use the more economy of force, one of the pillars of military doctrine, how to use achieve a more effective objective by using smaller forces, and that's the effectless operation as well. Achieving your effect with minimum force, and by using modern technologies, you can actually do that. Not entirely replacing the proxy forces, but also in many cases using advanced technologies in conjunction with the proxy forces. In many cases, training them to use advanced technologies, like in the case of Lebanese Hezbollah, they received training on how to use anti-ship missiles, and more recently precision missiles. And in the case of the Houthis, we saw the recent seizures of Iranian does heading for the Houthis, contained anti-tank missiles and anti-ship missiles and precision-guided cruise missiles. So perhaps these two elements complement each other to a large degree.
Yes, you ask why Revolutionary Guard did not step in this time in fighting against such a disease. Look, I think there could be several reasons. First is that they don't think that they would win this fight, or they can claim that they are the victor of they are the winner of this battle. And they don't want to share with the government the responsibility of the failure in controlling the coronavirus. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that the reputation of IRGC has been seriously damaged after downing the airplane. So they don't want to enter into another story in which makes them more fragile, and make them responsible before people, and any mistake would be, another serious problem for them. This time, the coronavirus, the way the government dealt with it, and the way clergy, because it mainly started from Qom, which is the center of Shia clergy. So this time, this incident has significantly tarnished the reputation of the clergy more than before, and also the Rouhani government. As you said, the Ministry of Health failed even to give accurate information about what's happening. So this is a good thing for Revolutionary Guard. So because both Rouhani government and clergy are Revolutionary Guard's rivals. So just let this failure weaken their competitors, and especially they need this strength for the next parliament, which would be predominantly run by Revolutionary Guard commanders and members.
Thank you. And now it's your turn. Let's see if there's any questions. Sir, if you wait for the microphone, by the way, it's right behind you.
Hi, thanks. Steve Collinson with CNN. Is it still the assumption that Iran will seek further retaliation for the killing of Soleimani, or have the political conditions that you've been laying out and that sense of that it's demonstrated its deterrence capabilities changed that calculation?
I can start, and then you guys can jump in. So in my view, what we saw following in the immediate aftermath of Soleimani's death, so the missile strikes against the two bases housing U.S. forces in Iraq, were really the big symbolic undertaking by Iran. The fact that you had the commander of the IRGC airspace unit come out and against the backdrop of, I should say, flags of various proxies, say this is Operation Martyr Qasem Soleimani, we have now completed it and it went really well. Of course, this was right before there were more news about the airliner being down, the downing of the airliner. All of that was essentially Iran making that big splash, kind of, undertaking that. But to me, that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the big immediate action they needed to take to kind of show force, right? To show muscle and to say that they've done something. And it's been, and I think it was not helpful that the news of the injured service members continued to come out for weeks after that. But in my view, we're going to continue seeing actions by Iran, but it's not going to be in the same form as missile strikes, direct, clear, and very much overt, with Iranians coming out and claiming victory and saying that they've done this. I think we'll see, and we have already seen to some extent, a return to them seeking action that would allow them more plausible deniability. So things that we had seen throughout the second half of 2019 and that we've seen so far in 2020. So actions via proxies, cyber attacks, but perhaps, and essentially things that allow Iran to kind of shield itself. Just one more point on this. And I think it's important to note that the way Iran typically operates is not big, splashy actions, right? Even throughout 2019, the one instance in which they did something and they said that they did it was the downing of the drone in the summer. And the reason for it is clear. They only take very direct and overt action when they can they feel like they have some grounds to stand on, when they feel like they can legitimize the action they've taken. When they don't feel like they can legitimize it in the eyes of their own domestic constituency and the international community, they tend to operate in a way that allows them to have plausible deniability.
If I can take off my hat as moderator and answer your comment. After the death of Soleimani, my greatest concern was that Iran would concentrate on trying to expel the United States out of Iraq, and that that would be accomplishing Soleimani's task after his death. and that I was worried that we might see a return to the situation we had in Iraq in September. By September of last year, Iran had effectively gotten an extraordinary influence in Iraq. And the United States forces were actually very limited in what they could do, and frankly, I didn't think they were playing much of a useful role in Iraq. Then we see the protests in Iraq. And the combination of the protests and then the 1-2 blow, because it's not only Soleimani gets killed, but after all, the most effective person for controlling the popular mobilization forces in Iraq gets killed. And I know that the days after Soleimani's death, there was a lot of noise about the vote in the parliament, which is that doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But we have to watch what's happening with the formation of the new Iraqi government, which there's some very disturbing indications of the last few days, but we'll see. But I would just simply say that really is the big game here. That was what Soleimani wanted to do, was to get the United States out of Iraq. And that's where the prize is. So Iranian retaliation against the United States doesn't have to take just the form of the use of kinetic force, right? The political actions that they could take Iraq principally, but also in persuading the Saudis and Emiratis that the United States doesn't have their back, and that those countries have got to do a deal with Iran. That would really accomplish the objectives that the Islamic Republic in general and Soleimani in particular had. So watch this space. I would say that at the moment, Iran's not having a whole lot of success with this, because the Iranian model turns out to be a really good way to disrupt societies. We've seen that the Iranian way of warfare has been quite effective, but Iran doesn't know how to rule. And so what we have seen in not only in Iraq, but also in Lebanon, and in fact even in Syria with these protests in Damascus over the last month, is that the Iranian model for how to run things, which is frankly a model of deal everybody into the corruption, and construct a system in which it's only the elite who advance, and pretty much ignore popular protests. That model is not working. It's not working in Iran, it's not working in Iraq, it's not working in Lebanon, and it's not working very well in Syria. So I don't think that Iran is necessarily going to be 10 feet tall when it comes to pursuing the Soleimani's objectives. Some more questions, sir.
I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired Foreign Service officer. I don't follow these things as closely as you people do. I wonder if you could help me understand the variety of security forces that are playing a role on the part of Iran. For example, it seems like you're using the terms IRGC and the Quds force almost interchangeably. And how does that differ from the armed forces, from the Basij forces, other paramilitary forces? Help us understand what are their roles and function, and who do they report to?
Well, the Quds Force is one branch of the IRGC. IRGC has a conventional, more or less a conventional role, and it is hardly an elite force. It just a conventional military organization with Air Force, Navy, and ground forces, and also Quds Force. Quds Force is more like an umbrella organization that serves the interests of the Islamic Revolution outside the Iranian borders, and they oversee both the military forces from within the IRGC, who are tasked with missions outside Iran, and also the foreign proxies. For example, they have a core cadre, parts of the members of the Quds Force, but most of the Quds Force operational personnel come from other IRGC branches for a certain period of time if there is a need for example, creating a missile capability for a certain proxy. They send personnel from the IRGC Air Force under Quds Force to a certain country for a certain period of time. For the regular forces, that's a completely different story. They usually do not get involved in foreign operations, but in certain cases, as has been we saw in Syria, also members of the National Armed Forces or Artesh have been tasked to certain missions in Syria under Quds Force, actually.
Preview of coming attractions. We have a study coming out shortly about some rather substantial changes that have taken place in the last 5 years, in which the Basij paramilitary force has found its role dramatically shifting, and the IRGC has created these provincial corps, which has taken on a great many of the repressive apparatus kind of functions that the Basij used to play.
If I may just add one more thing to the division of labor between the traditional conventional military, the Artesh, and the IRGC too, is that so initially the reason why the IRGC was created at the beginning of the revolution was to essentially provide a check against the Artesh, which was perceived by the revolutionaries as being loyal to the monarchy, to the population versus the new regime. Of course, that's changed as the Artesh was purged immediately after the revolution. It's a different Artesh today than it was 50 years ago. But what's been interesting is that the two branches have increasingly created a division of labor in a lot of areas. But that division of labor exists more in certain realms and less in others. So, for example, the IRGC and the Artesh Navy have pretty distinct tasks that they do. That's not always necessarily the case in terms of ground forces, for example. In the air, the Artesh Air Force has the upper hand because it has better equipment and so on. It has traditionally, now that may be changing, than the IRGC. So there's been a division of labor. There's been an effort to create a division of labor, but that hasn't always translated effectively in practice.
You're up in front.
Thank you very much. Bilal Wahab from the Washington Institute. You mentioned the coronavirus already, if I can get back to that issue. So it seems that Iran is now under two pressures. There's the political pressure from the U.S. sanctions, and whatever the U.S. sanctions, whatever passed or escaped the U.S. sanctions is now going to probably be taken by this coronavirus net. How is this going to impact how Iran behaves both at home and also in the region? Thanks.
We don't know. We just don't know. The country is somehow got disconnected from the world outside. The borders with 6 neighbors have been closed. And when I was watching some reports on BBC that export was totally, got into trouble, especially with cities like Qom, which became actually in recent years a very important economic center in Iran. And just 2 days before they announced the coronavirus epidemic in Qom, a very important Chinese businessman died in the city. So which means that there is a very close economic ties between the city and some Chinese companies. And something that many people may not know is that probably Qom has the largest Chinese community in the country, because more than 700 Chinese are studying in Qom Seminary, Al Mustafa University, with their family. So there should be something over 2,000 Chinese citizens residing in the city. So the government does not cease lying to people about many things, and actually do not. They are trying to underestimate the problem, play down the implication, including the economic implication of this disease, and we don't have any serious official report about how government is planning to deal with its implication in different fields, including economy. At least I haven't seen anything.
Bilal, do bear in mind that for all that we're concentrating on the virus at the moment, that at least so far the mortality rate seems to be on the order of 2%. So if that persists, then in a year from now, the Iranian government will be able to stand up and say, see, we beat it, and we only lost 2% of the people, and 98% of us are still here. And that would fit with their general approach of seeing the bright side of everything.
So, I mean, the common thread between all these things, right, the situation with the economy, the downing of the airliner, coronavirus, is incompetence and mismanagement. And that, to me, more so than anything else, is really the reason why we're seeing this huge blow to the regime's legitimacy, and the reason why the regime is finding itself in a position where it has to kill hundreds and shut down the internet to reassert control. I think there is an understanding that they've lost some of that control, and they need to restore it. But of course, they can't do it due to competence, because it's clearly not there, or proper management, because clearly they're incapable of proper management. And so they've resorted to sheer force. And I think that's displaying itself. This incompetence has displayed itself domestically, but also in the way they've been handling a lot of their sort of foreign affairs. And Patrick was mentioning some of the repercussions of that earlier on.
If I may, I would add one thing, that if you look at the report, it's really frightening, because it looks, because we are approaching Eid al-Nowruz, the beginning of Persian year. And usually people start to, make shopping, in these days. But people, first of all, if you look at the pictures and, video clips of the shopping centers, nobody's there. And there is a significant increase in the price of basic needs, and on the other hand, there is a significant decrease in the value of Toman, and a significant increase in the value of gold. So it's like people treating this situation like a plague, something very new. For the first time in the history of Islamic Republic, the Friday prayer was cancelled in 23 cities, including Tehran and Qom. And for the first time I think in the modern history, the Hazrat Masum Shrine in Qom was closed. So these are not something that you would find any similar example in the modern history for it. So I think it's economically should be hard, and more than reality, people panicked. So its psychological impact is very important. The government does not recognize all this implication.
And then 3 weeks from now, during the Nowruz holiday, last year 10 million Iranians traveled from one city to another. Just imagine what's going to happen this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I mean, people will be scared to travel, and people will be scared of travelers coming from other cities. So.
And the government did not close the schools and university. These are parents who prevent their children to go to schools.
And back?
Hilo Fradkin of the Hudson Institute. I wanted to ask Mr. Nadimi, you said in the course of your remarks that the IRGC thinks they can win in their struggle with the United States via this strategy. And I was wondering why they think that. And to Mehdi, I was wondering about one other possibility concerning the succession. Could Khamenei try to manage it himself before he dies? And what that would, why hasn't he tried to do that? Or what would it look like?
I think the IRGC believes both offensively and defensively that they can sustain, and not only sustain U.S. military attack, but also to win any war against the United States, because they believe they are hardened enough with hardened facilities and also with offensive capabilities using the ballistic missiles, and there are enough interests of the United States within their range, and then that's it. They can offer a rich target environment for Iran to work on, and right before the killing of Qasem Soleimani, they indeed believed that they had such a deterrence against the United States. That operation shook them to their core, and they decided to seek revenge, and to do that quite rapidly, so they could restore that deterrence. And I believe the lack of response by the United States to the missile attack against the Al-Assad base, to some degree, at least in the minds of the IRGC decision makers, has restored that deterrence. And as Qasem Soleimani mentioned several times in his remarks, that they have worked hard for the past 30 years on a daily basis to create this capability to be able to severely degrade U.S. interests and military capabilities in the region.
As I pointed out, Islamic Republic tried to appoint a successor for the Supreme Leader while the Supreme Leader was alive in 1986. When Khomeini was alive, the Assembly of Experts appointed Montazeri as his successor, but it didn't go well because he became a center of power. He established his own empire. He became, a threat for the Supreme Leader himself. He started to challenge some of his most important decisions, including the way the political prisoners were treated. So this time, Khamenei learned from that experience. He doesn't make any gesture which indicates that he wants to make this or that Ayatollah as his successor. He doesn't. He looks reluctant to coach anyone to become his replacement, and we don't know about any other measures he's planning to do after his death. But I think that whatever he does after his death, things go totally in a very unexpected and unpredictable way, because these people who show their loyalty to Khamenei today, after his death, they start to fight against each other, and nobody can control them, because Khamenei has destroyed any independent authority who can control this kind of conflicts. So none of them are above other. So you have different. Khamenei was weak, so he tried to keep everyone weak in order to control them, in order to manage the conflict between them. So I think no matter what he think today, yesterday would be totally another day. Tomorrow would be totally another day, yeah. As yesterday was.
Howard LaFranchi with the Christian Science Monitor. Thank you. I'm wondering if you see any impact from the Soleimani killing on the nuclear program, or how the government might proceed or use the program in the coming years?
I can only throw my hands up and say, don't know. I think it's too early to tell. Iran has had a history of being very patient with its nuclear program. The program started in the 1950s under the Shah. It was resumed after being briefly stopped following the revolution. And they've been very patient with it. So what we do know is that currently Iran has taken a number of steps to dial down its implementation of the nuclear deal. They announced, in fact, the fifth step just the weekend after Soleimani's death, right? So Soleimani was killed on Friday or Thursday, and they made the announcement about the fifth step, dialing down that implementation of the JCPOA on the Sunday. But the fifth step has been interesting in that it was more of a political statement than some of the previous steps. The previous four steps, every time they announced something, it was pretty concrete, that they were going to stop abiding by the stockpile limits, for example, imposed by the deal, that they were going to resume enrichment activities in Fordo. All of those things were pretty clear, pretty practical, pretty concrete, and they immediately followed it with action. Whereas this time around, that's not been the case. It was a sort of a general, we no longer see ourselves as bound by any restrictions on the enrichment program, but there haven't been any practical steps that go beyond what they had done in the past. Now, this may change over the next few months. I think there is a bit of a reluctance to jump ahead on the part of the regime because they're trying to kind of gauge and see what happens here in November and whether President Trump is reelected, whether you have a Democrat who comes into office who's, all of whom at this stage have, I think nearly all of whom have promised to return to the JCPOA or try to return to the JCPOA. So I think they're trying to patiently see what happens there. But in terms of the decision making to go back to a weaponization program versus continuing this kind of the program that they've had since the JCPOA itself, we don't really know yet, and it's really, really hard to know, short of any kind of intelligence or IAEA report indicating that for now. But I mean, to me, this is a stress on the system, and it's certainly opened, I think it's certainly opened conversation within the system, whether to revisit it or not. But again, whether or not that decision has been made, we just don't know.
By the way, a new IAEA report is due out this week, and it will be the first under their new Director General. And there is quite a issue about Iranian lack of cooperation on answering questions about certain man-made nuclear material, i.e. enriched uranium, that the inspectors found at a site that they visited. So there's going to be quite a push by the U.S. government to make a splash about this issue.
If I may add something to Ariane's response, I think from the military point of view, the killing of Qasem Soleimani showed Iran that even having a conventional missile deterrence can also be undermined if the U.S. has the opportunity to go for a decapitation operation, and that added by the certain technological trends that we are seeing, that Iran, for example, has been developing high-performance solid fuel boosters that can directly be used in development of a actual real ICBM, can show that Iran is investing in that sort of technology, and having an ICBM without a nuclear warhead would be meaningless. So if they have been developing this capability, and if they are seeing a lack of credible deterrence in having a conventional missile program arsenal, together it shows that they will be going the path of at least the capability to build nuclear warheads for their future ICBMs quickly.
And up here,
Thank you. Mike Kurtzig, formerly of the USDA on the Iran desk. You keep on talking about hardware and keep military hardware and so on, but the budget must be a catastrophe. And you spoke a little bit about imports and exports. Have they stopped? I mean, have oil exports stopped completely? Are they earning any foreign exchange? Where's the money coming from this? And is there enough food? I mean, in the long run, Iran is dependent on a lot of food imports. And how about medicine and about the people in general? Maybe, Ariane, you mentioned before a little bit about the problems of funding or trade and so on. Could you comment on that? Do we have any numbers? Maybe, Pat, you have the numbers, perhaps. Thank you.
I believe a lot of trends that show that even they are having a very elaborate military program, and they are developing all sorts of weapons. That is also an opportunity to reduce costs when you develop your entire systems internally, and you do not need to import them, and that reduces cost. And despite reports, outside reports that many of these programs incur a lot of costs, I think the IRGC has managed to contain the costs of their programs, for example, certain missile programs, to a more acceptable level.
While Iran's economy is not doing well, this is not Venezuela. For one thing, after decades of not doing very much to develop the non-oil economy, Iran actually has, over the last 10 or 15 years, done quite a bit to diversify the economy. The Iranian government exaggerates a bit when they say that their non-crude oil exports exceed their imports. But because they include whatever, they have very substantial non-oil exports, and including petrochemicals and other oil-based things. But still, look, for instance, Iran's become a net exporter of food. This is a dramatic change from what the situation of 20 years ago. And the Iranian budget is much less dependent upon oil revenues than it was in the past. However, the big problem that Iran has for its international trade is that the U.S. Restrictions have made it very difficult for Iran to make use of the foreign exchange that it has. First, it has difficulty getting access to foreign exchange. So even a country like Iraq, a country where Iran has substantial influence, there are some, the Iranians complain that there's $5 billion and frozen in the Iraqi central bank that Iran does not have access to. I think it's a bit exaggerated. I think Iran has limited access to the money, but not no access. It's very difficult for Iran to find ways to make use of the resources that it does have abroad, because it's very hard to find financing channels through which to operate it. There are some. The U.S. government, in fact, has been cooperating with efforts to allow the export of humanitarian goods to Iran. Just today, the U.S. and the Swiss governments announced the finalization of this humanitarian trade mechanism that will permit Swiss companies and Swiss banks to export goods, and the Treasury Department clarified a number of things about the U.S. sanctions, which showed that it is possible to use the Central Bank of Iran to carry out transactions for humanitarian trade. But it's tough to find a bank that's interested in maneuvering through all of the complicated regulations, and the banking industry in general has gone through a strategy of de-risking and of getting out of activities that could get them into regulatory trouble. And so most big international banks' attitude towards trade with Iran is, yuck, well, we don't want to get involved, go there. Even the things which are perfectly permissible. But
And speaking of things which are perfectly permissible, I want to thank all of our participants for having been here, and I have to give you permission to leave because really we have run out of time. But thanks much.
That was a great segue.